The 2017 Mining Indaba Conference kicked off today in Cape Town. CNBC Africa spoke to Dambisa Moyo, global economist and author, on some of the economic concerns highlighted by economic growth forecasters for the year ahead.
As an economist, of course, I spend a lot of time looking at forecasts. They're not always 100% accurate, but I think the concerns are really based on where the forecasts are, but also the underpinnings of those forecasts. So global forecasts remain pretty weak, very much in line with what the expectations have been post the financial crisis. As I mentioned in my speech, the United States, still the largest economy in GDP terms, only posted a 1.6% growth, GDP growth last year, 2016. And even if you think about the African continent, we're expecting about a 3% growth rate this year. Remember, we need to get 7% in order to double per capita incomes in one generation. So we're far below that number. And the largest economies like South Africa and Nigeria are really posting very low. I mean, South Africa has less than 1% growth rates. So those are the concerns globally. China, upon which Africa depends a lot in terms of foreign direct investment and trade, is also struggling, particularly in a world where the United States has become much more protectionist. We know that China does a lot of exporting to the United States, so there are real concerns around what that means for not just China, but the knock-on effects for Africa as well.
And that's one thing you mentioned, this increase in protectionism. You've seen a lot more trade barriers going up in the last year.
Yeah.
How damaging could that be for the economies of Africa in the long term?
Well, you know, again, to the extent that you're dependent on trade and globalization, of which many African countries, particularly as commodity exporters, not just of grains and of foodstuffs, but also in terms of base metals, a lot of the mining sector, I think really has to figure out a way to navigate this path. It doesn't mean that there won't be countries that remain open. I think China, for example, will continue to be very much pro-globalization. We heard that from the President Xi Jinping in Davos at the World Economic Forum. I think that that's something that African countries can rely upon, but I think that more generally there are questions about aggregate demand. How much demand will come from China in a world where they're not able to sell goods themselves to the United States? So we are in a globalized economy, and so the consequences, I think, will be negative and they will be felt.
And one thing you did mention as well, something that a lot of people overlook, is the rapid growth in world population, which is like to put strains on the economies across the continent, particularly Africa. What's your perspective here?
Yeah, so, you know, I strongly believe a growing population should be a good thing. I've spent a lot of time both in the United States and across Europe, where they're desperate for a large population that is young, that is going to be the workforce of tomorrow. Africa has that. The question, though, is how do you actually leverage that? How do you ensure that people are skilled and able to participate in the global economy? And that's a lot of investment and a lot of real quality investment, not just throwing money at the problem, but real quality investment in education, so that we can actually benefit in a way that many other regions of the world are struggling today.
What about this migration of skilled people to the Northern Hemisphere? I mean, a few years ago, a magazine did a survey here that said something, the majority of Africans would risk their lives crossing the Mediterranean Sea if it meant getting to Europe or America or whatever. I mean, what do you think? Do you think this is going to get worse?
Well, I mean, I think, look, the European continent right now is struggling itself. I think that a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people were traveling to Europe for economic opportunities, some of them for political refugees. We know that 65 million people today around the world are refugees. This is the highest number since World War II. So there are real issues around what that immigration story looks like. But I think fundamentally, if you think about capital, labor, and productivity, these three key engines of economic growth, Africa should be a place to invest, and there should be an optimistic story here. But it's really on public policymakers to craft a message that is not wholly dependent on what happens to America or what happens to China. What is it that these African governments are doing to make their story compelling, to make people want to invest and live and thrive in the African context?